Good evening. As we begin tonight, I want to take a minute to acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land. Here in Seattle, these are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders, past, present, and future, and we thank them for their stewardship of this land. Welcome to tonight's program with Omar El Akkad and Ajoma Oluo, presented with Elliott Bay Book Company. I have just a couple quick announcements before we get started. First, I wanted to thank the folks that make tonight's program possible. We're grateful to the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation and the Seattle Times for their generous support of library programs. And thank you as well to the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everyone in our community. I also wanted to let you know we have assistive listening technology available tonight. There's a couple little headsets on the table there with the blue tablecloth. If you find that you need one once the event is underway, you can just give me a little wave and I can bring it to you if that's easier. And finally, you received a survey when you came in. We really appreciate it if you take a minute to fill it out after the event. It helps us understand what it is, what kind of programming you're looking for at the library, and you can give us other feedback about other things. So thank you in advance for filling that out. Now I am delighted to introduce our welcome Rick Simonson from Elliott Bay Book Company, who's going to introduce tonight's speakers. Hi, Rick.
Thank you, Stasha, and thank you everyone for being here. In the summer of 2016, I was in New York and was visiting a publishing friend and in a very quiet office. It was a hot August day and there was no one around except this man. And we'd known each other for many years. He had me all kinds of books over time. And he said, and including books by people one would not have heard of. And he said, I have something for you. And it had been sent to him by an agent from Toronto. And he kind of put together this writer's background that he was born in Egypt, that he'd grown up in Qatar, and then had become a Canadian journalist, but also was now living outside Portland. There was a lot of the world to try and grab in a brief part. And that book, that novel was a book called American War, which knowing it had been written before 2016, all the work that leads to a book being written, the reality that was in that book, which one time might have not seemed so plausible, was becoming more and more apparent. And it was published in 2017 when those, a riven, deeply divided, this is projected in the 2070s, country was written of. And it foretold all sorts of things that we seem to already be living through now. That novel was followed 4 years later by What Strange Paradise, a book centering around the refugee situation in the Mediterranean, the outcome of wars, of colonialism in the Middle East, what we're calling the Middle East, and in the very human, personal stories. Again, a beautiful, brilliant book. Saying this because Omar El Akkad's first two books are novels and yet reflect a deep engagement with the world and with how the world is lived in and weighed and acted out on. So it's on one level, the book he's written tonight isn't a surprise because of all it bears and says. This book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, has just been published 2 days ago. And it's how it got written and why it got written, I think will get drawn out by two people, Omar being one of them, who will be able to really do that. But I would say from the perspective of reading writers, I have not seen another contemporary novelist go from writing novels to writing a book like this since Arundhati Roy, after The Gods Small Things, started writing these incredible books, not just about India, but also the United States in Iraq, and in a time when very few writers here were doing that kind of writing. And maybe a literary ancestor to both of them in the 20th century would be James Baldwin, writing fiction, then writing these morally charged, impassioned, grounded, but also there's something that moves you in reading what Omar's written. And he's going to read a little bit from this book, and then he'll be in conversation with Ajoma Oluo, who also can attest to being a citizen of the world, and engaged with the political and the cultural, the historical and the colonial aspects of what the world is and what the world has been. So they will do that after Omar reads a little bit, and then Omar will sign books. The editor of this book, Omar, I will say this in case Omar doesn't get this, the editor of this book has also had a real hand in it, a man named John Freeman, who I think kind of challenged Omar to write it, because Omar was saying things. And I think it was initially a tweet which became the book's title. And the response to that, to the silence and the complicity of the liberal West in what was happening in Gaza and Israel, has served as some of the groundwork of what Omar is saying in this book. I've been telling people about this book, but I need to stop talking because you get to hear the person who wrote it from it tonight. I like what am I doing? And to also say the language is so elemental of where it takes you as a reader. I mean, reading some of the reviews, Dina Nieri, who is a writer who was born in Iran and has written a lot about what's going on in the relation of U.S. and England and Iran, Iraq, and the Middle East, wrote this incredible review in The Guardian for this book, with her own some of her own experience in it. And I think it's something that Omar, writing here in the United States, is also giving voice to many other people in the world who have had to live what the people of Gaza have been living and dying with. So on that, I guess I will ask you to now thank you again for being here. And he will sign books afterwards, and books are over there, all three of Omar's books, as well as Idioma's. Let me say, Idioma, the paperback of Be a Revolution just came out. Yay. And she has been such a gracious, generous presence. I mean, even when it's her own book, and then certainly she's played this role with writers known and unknown, and really expanding things. And she just got back a few weeks ago from going to the Jaipur Literature Festival in India, a first ever trip for her. I have friends who run that festival. They wrote me and said she blew people away over there, and was a good guest. Not everyone from the U.S. Not everyone from the U.S. is, or UK. So thank you again for being here. And now please join in giving the warmest of welcomes to Omar El-Akkad, who will read first.
Hello, how are you? I can work with that. We can make that work. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really, really appreciate it. Very grateful to the public library and to Breaking Everyone at Elliott Bay, who have been incredibly supportive for no discernible reason over many years now. This is new for me. We launched in the UK and Ireland a few weeks ago. And none of my experiences there have been transferable to this side of the ocean. So I have no idea how these things are going to go yet. I'm still trying to sort of get my bearings. I also haven't read yet publicly from this. So I'm trying to lower your expectations as much as humanly possible before we sort of get into this. Yeah, so a few months ago, the folks at Penguin Random House called up and they said, listen, we can't put these words in anybody else's mouth. You're going to have to read your own audiobook. And I said, sure, I have no experience doing that. What could possibly go wrong? We're going to be fine, right? And so I went into a studio in Portland where these two poor sound engineers just had to sit there and listen to me stumble and like weep my way through a book. And it was just deeply unpleasant for them. I hope they got paid a lot of money for those 2 days. But it made me realize how much I sort of half-ass most of my life. Like you go to the gym and like you're tired, you don't do the full rep, you know. You can't do that when two sound engineers are listening to every word. Like you can't breathe through a word and then they're like, it's fine. So anyway, I got a pretty good sense of we were making a lot of changes as we were going through it because you'd read them out loud and realize, oh my God. So I'm going to read you the prologue, which is not like the rest of the book. I don't know what it's like. I spent a long time on the prologue. I spent 2 months on the prologue, which is weird because it's like 4 pages essentially. I don't know that you need to know anything, except please bear with me because again, this is, we had the launch event in Portland 2 days ago, and this is the second event. Oh, you're kind. You're kind. Yeah, let's get it out of the way now because there's going to be very little clapping after we're done. She is fog-colored when they find her. She believes she has ended. Like porters in service of some grotesque nobility, 6 men carry the stretcher out of something cavernous, something that used to be a home. And she, a girl of 9 or 10, is whisked away. Sitting on the stretcher, dazed and bloodied, she looks off to the side. She appears to be searching. The men who carry the stretcher move with urgency, as if the doing of care, of gentleness, can undo what has happened to this girl, to this place, to the bodies yet to be dug from beneath the rubble. Someone nearby asks God for revenge. Perhaps God is here somewhere, also searching. A soldier I met many years ago, who made the study of industrial violence his hobby, once told me the first thing that kills when a bomb goes off isn't shrapnel or fire. It's the overpressure wave, air forced violently outward from the site of the blast. What you're supposed to do, he said, is drop to the ground and cover your ears. Breathe out. Empty your lungs before the air collides with and flattens them. Of course, if you're close enough, nothing you do or don't do will make any difference at all. He said the force of the overpressure wave weakens in proportion to the cube of the distance from the site of impact, which is to say, the most effective thing you can do to avoid getting killed by a missile or a mine or a grenade is to be far away when it goes off. How do you do that? I asked. Do what? Know when a thing like that is about to happen. Know to be far away. Well, he said, and trailed off. A few minutes later, he was telling the story of a freak accident his daughter had suffered as a toddler, how carrying her to the emergency room was the scariest thing he'd ever experienced. Even in his line of work, even with all he'd seen, the scariest thing. As the men carry the girl out of what used to be her home, she asks if they're going to take her to the cemetery. One of the men says, MashaAllah, MashaAllah. In literal translation, the word means what God wills. A closer approximation of meaning, of one meaning, is something like, what has happened is what God willed. But English, tasked with a word like this, turns stiff and monophonic, and MashaAllah is orchestral. To any ear that grew up on this language, it is clear that what the man means when he says this word is something else entirely. Something instantly familiar to generations who've heard it spilling out the mouths of beaming grandmothers at the end of piano recitals and graduation ceremonies and at the first sight of a newborn. Used this way, it finds its principal purpose as an expression of joy. Look at this wonderful thing God has done. MashaAllah. Language, too, forces the air from the lungs. Beyond the high walls and barbed wire and checkpoints that pen this place, there is the empire. And the empire as well is cocooned inside its own fortress of language, a language through the prism of which buildings are never destroyed, but rather spontaneously combust, in which blasts come and go like Chinooks over the mountain, and people are killed as though to be killed is the only natural and rightful ordering of their existence, as though living was the aberration. And this language might protect the empire's most bloodthirsty fringe, but the fringe has no use for linguistic malpractice. It is instead the middle, the liberal, well-meaning, easily upset middle that desperately needs the protection this kind of language provides. Because it is the middle of the empire that must look upon this and say, yes, this is tragic, but necessary. Because the alternative is barbarism. The alternative to the countless killed and maimed and orphaned and left without home, without school, without hospital, and the screaming from under the rubble, and the corpses disposed of by vultures and dogs, and the days-old babies left to scream and starve, is barbarism. The girl on the stretcher believes she has ended. A man says to her, "Intizay al-Amr, you are like the moon." Again, translation fails. There is no English equivalent to the lineage of this phrase, a lineage that runs through generations of old movies and love songs and family gatherings. Listen to the sly setting joy and pleading, raw pleading, that carries the words as this man tells the girl who lived when so many others died that she is beautiful beyond the bounds of this world. Zay al-Amr. Something has ended here, but something else begins. The dead dig wells in the living. Thank you. This is where we find out if the mics work or not.
I know, right?
Is this,
All the,
can you hear us? Is this,
Okay,
all right,
let-
cool.
let me straighten it because I'm gonna start fidgeting immediately.
Yeah,
Oh,
right.
all right. Okay,
Oh, that's good.
yeah, right?
That's better than mine. I'm sitting perfectly still for the rest of the night 'cause I'm terrified, straight up terrified.
Well, you know what? You went through that reading pretty well. I feel like it's hard. It's not,
Yeah, I mean, it's, um, I don't know how you think about readings. Like, do you have a go-to section that you read with your books? Do you switch it up?
I don't read anymore.
You don't?
Writing about anti-Black racism and crying and looking into a sea of white faces, I can't. And so I just stopped. I used to, and I realized, like, you know, I think, and you probably get this in a way too, I think when you're writing articles and pieces, these are things you've processed, these are things you can look at. A book demands what it demands. And I don't think I've realized in a lot of my books how little I had had time to heal or process the things I'm writing about until you're in front of 200 people.
Yeah.
And you're feeling it. And I'm just like, nope, I can't do that. So I actually don't do readings anymore. But it was beautiful. And I can say, like, one of the most affecting openings to a book that I have read in a long time.
Thank you.
As a writer, this book like makes me want to write more. It's so beautifully written, and I'm so excited to talk to you about it, and especially to share it here with community. Hi, everybody! Thank you for coming. And I'll say too, I know so many of the faces out here that I've seen in protests over the last year and a half that I'm in community with. I'm so glad that y'all get to engage with this amazing, beautiful book and be in this room. I guess I would love to start first. Let me open up my notes so I'm not just winging it. The title is amazing. The title is amazing. And I know that this was kind of like taken from like a social media post, but it's also a thing that we talk about a lot, right? Like you know, people who claim that they would have acted differently at all these other points of time in history. And we're in one of those moments where people are not acting differently and are. And I want to talk a little bit about like the kind of where this title comes from and like how that ended up turning into a book.
Sure, yeah. First of all, thank you so much for doing this. Really, really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm not much of a social media guy. As you're about to find out, we're going to get through like 2.5 questions. That's how much I ramble. There's going to be just long ass answers. I don't do that very often. I stopped completely a few months ago, but back in October of 2023, I was sitting down one night and I wrote this thing about how, you know, one day when it's safe, when there's nobody left to hold accountable, it's going to be okay to have always been against this, the same way you know, it's much harder now to find somebody who is like always for apartheid or segregation. I'm sure there are many, but I was thinking of the kind of person who keeps their head down and just looks up every once in a while to see where the balance of polite society is, and that's where they're going to be, right? And I didn't think much of it, and then I guess it sort of, you know, a lot of people clicked on it or but independent of that, I had been working on this, essentially what this became. And it was only months later, after the first draft was completed, where one of my editors said, you know, this would make a good title. And so now I have to make it a point at every event to make sure that everybody understands I didn't just take a tweet and stretch it out to 200 pages. I promise you that's not how that went. But it's interesting to me because, you know, I'm watching it in real time, right? We launched this book in the UK and Ireland a few weeks ago, and so that was my introduction into sort of how this is going to go. And my Italian editor happened to be in town and was like, oh, we have this journalist, he really wants to meet you, he wants to do, like, all right, cool. So the guy comes over and turns out to be a very, very committed Zionist. And so we have this very weird 45 minutes, but you know, we're two human beings, I can connect with anybody, it's fine. But at one point he keeps saying, you know, you call this a genocide, this isn't a genocide. It was disproportionate. And I was like, that's really interesting, because you've moved now to disproportionate, right? There's some exchange rate in your mind of bodies, and we have hit a certain point where now it's disproportionate. And I was curious about that just conceptually, how someone thinks about it that way, because there's been so many conversations that I've had recently where there's no real animosity. I'm not going to pick a fight with anybody. I'm not, you know, but you do feel like you're on opposite ends of a chasm from someone, and that you can't bridge it. You just can't.
Right.
So I was thinking about all of these things when I was putting the book together, and that's sort of how the title came to be. The original title was The Glass Coffin. I was thinking about this idea that when your life is considered completely worthless, and when your people's life is considered completely worthless, one of the most offensive thing you can do to the systems of power that consider you worthless is to just show them the carnage, to sort of. And you know, we see it in this country, right? I mean, entire social media systems could be taken offline, and you know, the amount of work that goes into just don't show me this. So that was the original line of thought, and then it ended up being this.
It's beautiful. Well, it's a beautiful title, and it's a very compelling title, and I think it speaks to one thing that struck me about this book actually is how universal the story is when we're talking about empire, and you're taking this very urgent, immediate thing, this genocide in Gaza, but weaving it in to stories of empire and the violence that empire commits and has always committed. And I love the way in which you utilize your history as a journalist in this, especially when so many journalists are failing to do just that, and so many writers are failing really in their commitment to the craft and, you know, to what I think is our moral duty as writers, to tell the truth. And I love the way in which you take this thing that everyone says is complicated and exists outside the bounds. Everyone says that what's happening in Gaza exists outside of the bounds of conversation of colonization or empire or racialized violence, and you put it right back into it and connect it. What was it like for you? Because I know that you're interweaving your own story and your family's story into this. Were these parallels that came up to you immediately, or were you had to sit with it for a while and kind of tease it apart?
That's a really interesting question. So I was talking about how I was rewriting this book right up until the very, very end, right? And if they'd given me more time with it, I would keep rewriting it. If they give it back to me now, I would continue rewriting. And there's two main reasons for that, right? One is just like, I'm a fairly naive person, and I take things in good faith, and like so many things that were presented initially as facts turn out to be lies. And so you're constantly sort of adjusting for that. But the other reason has to do with just like, I'm this guy. Like, you can't walk away from writing a book like this without addressing your own cowardice, without addressing the fact that you are that like, There's a reason I sound the way I do, right? I often say this. There's a reason if I called any of you up and said my name was John Smith, you'd probably believe me, right? From the age of 5, I've been oriented towards this part of the world, and it shapes everything about me. And so you get into this situation where you are trying to figure out who you are in a relationship with empire, and all of the things that you were anchored with suddenly coming loose. And again, this is like a function of my own naivete. I was in Afghanistan, I was in Guantanamo Bay, I saw the cracks, I saw the ways in which this works. And maybe that break should have come a long time ago. But the act of waking up for a year and a half and every day opening up your computer and just seeing evidence of the worst things that human beings can do to one another, and being told that if you oppose this in any way, you are the bad guy. There's an immediacy and an intimacy and a complicity in that you can't just sidestep. And earlier drafts did sidestep it. Like earlier drafts, when I would read back and I would think, you're deliberately not talking about this. One of the examples, like one of the criticisms, this guy read an early copy of this book and wrote me a 6-page PDF on a part that he thought was complete bullshit. And he was partially right. But there's been all these sort of criticisms, and some of them are completely useless to me. Like, I don't care about the go back where you came from stuff. Like, it doesn't matter. I'm going to get that anyway. You can't make yourself small enough to sort of not get that. But there's been things like, for example, oh, you talk about resistance and you talk about resistance to empire, and then you get real squishy around the idea of armed resistance. And it's like, yeah, that's true. And I could leave it like that. Or I could contend with several very real factors. One is that I can sit here and tell you that I'm this committed pacifist and that I abhor all kinds of violence, and I might even believe that. But by virtue of how my tax dollars are spent, I'm one of the most violent human beings on earth. And so, like, you know, it's real easy to say that kind of shit when you're on the launching side of the missiles.
Right.
On top of that, I have no right to tell anybody how to resist their occupation. And so the act of trying initially to sidestep all of that stuff, the ways in which I had sort of marinated in the very thing that I am now suddenly unmoored from, was easily the most difficult sort of conceptual part of writing the book. I know it's a book that barges in through the door, sort of pretending to pick all these arguments. I don't want to convince anyone of anything. I'm done arguing with people. If you're across that chasm from me, then I'm not bringing you over, I don't think. But I think there has to be a kind of reckoning with that separation, because I don't know who the hell I am on the other side of that. Right? It's been 40 years this, and I think that the lasting sort of aftertaste for me of this book is not even of indictment; it's of a deep, deep uncertainty.
Right, and I think that that's so beautiful and important, because I've said before, I think that, you know, white supremacy is fundamentally a war on imagination, right? The idea that certain people are capable of certain things, certain people are born for certain things, and that systems that exist have always existed and will always exist, and don't try to imagine anything different. And there is something terrifying about the after, right? And I think that that often is what gets in the way of true radicalization in the political sense of, you know, the fight to revolutionize and fundamentally, completely change the systems that we live in. If that is all we've known, and we have always known our place in it, whether our place is in constant oppression of it, constantly mildly pushing against it, what happens when you destroy it? What happens when you completely divorce from it? Who are you in that context? I think that terrifies everyone. And that's the number one question I get all the time, right? Is, well, what would we do instead? What would replace it if we got rid of this? And, you know, I studied political science. I don't know how many professors said, well, you know, our system is messed up, but it's the best in the world.
Yeah.
You know, it's the best we got. Like, I mean, I'm sure you all have heard that, and it's ridiculous, right? It's like, this is
Yeah.
This is the best. This is, we all got together, what, you know, some weirdos 300 years ago got together and said, this is it. And we were like, done, can't beat that. But the what's next and the who are you in context of that I think is, and like the thought of ego and, letting go of that and moving towards that is really terrifying. And I love that you're wrestling with that, stepping into that and saying, yeah, I am stepping into this abyss, like into this unknown place, and that's it. And it's not, and now everything's beautiful.
Yeah.
And now I have beautiful new purpose, and I wake up and that's what everyone wants. They want to know, like, I mean, I have faith that we can do better than this. We're kind of near the worst case scenario right now. So I mean, why not? I'll hand this over to just about anyone at this point. But I love that. And I think part of what I loved too is when you were talking about kind of the universality of supremacist thinking. And like when you're drawing parallels between like in Arab Spring and people like family members becoming uncomfortable with a more radicalized working class and lower class, and like how similar they sound to Trump voters. And I have felt watching how many like Nigerians came out for Trump, I was like, y'all understand? Like,
Yeah.
when they talk about shithole countries, like this is literally like on the list of countries. But that thinking and that the way in which people often imagine themselves in a different place on this strata, and how threatened they are when it's interrupted, and how quickly the language looks the same across the board. And I wanted to ask you about that and what it felt, as you were putting that in there and like looking at, your experiences around the world with this. A lot of times we'll talk in very concrete terms of like, this is white supremacy, and white supremacy is a very important thing, but it's one of many systems that categorize us and give us these slots to fall into that we protect, even while we recognize that we may be harmed in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a story, I think I kept it in the book. My mom got angry at me, so I may have toned it down a bit. But so essentially, we were living in Qatar. We'd left Egypt. My dad had to get the hell out of Egypt when I was about 5. And we were living in Qatar, and our relatives were living there too. And this side of the family, when the kids were very young, decided to go to Sweden. And so the kids grew up in Sweden, fully, fluent in the language and the culture and so on and so forth. And years later, like 20, 30 years later, we go to visit. And my relative is showing me around town. And this Beamer comes like flying past. This guy's windows open. It's just blasting Arabic music. And my relative just looks over and she's like, "Goddamn Arabs." And I was like, "Oh, you've made it. You moved up. You went one step up, and that's the perks of being one step up, right? Is you get to do that now." I think like there's this incredible sort of imaginative poverty that kicks in once the system works for you, or once you believe the system works for you. Because like when I was sitting there with that Italian journalist, so many of the questions seemed to boil down to like, oh, you don't want these people to be slaughtered? Who do you want to be slaughtered then?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, you believe that there's two positions, right? You're stepping on the neck or you're having your neck stepped on. And if I'm telling you to release your foot, well, the next stage is now you're down, And whereas the imaginative obligations of trying to think of something better are essentially infinite. Like you and me are sitting here trying to dream up a better world. Maybe you want to burn the whole damn thing down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I want to like tax billionaires a bit more. Like, like we might find some common ground, but generally speaking, like the sky's the limit, right? And so whenever I think of these things, I just think of the immense asymmetry of obligation. If you want something better than this, if you want to resist this ongoing slaughter after decades of occupation, and here's what's expected of you, right? Like go chain yourself to the gates of a weapons manufacturer, go sit at your campus and be pepper sprayed by the same administration that's supposed to protect you, risk your career, risk your livelihood, risk imprisonment, risk everything. If you're in support of this, all you have to do is look away, right? You don't even have to get your hands dirty. Just genuine, just look away. It'll all be over soon, right? That's the central promise every time. And so the things I think about a lot when I think of the movements that are actually doing the work, I'm some guy who sits in the woods in Oregon and writes a book. I mean, it doesn't matter in the slightest, but the people out there actually doing the work, the two things that sort of worry me the most tend to be exhaustion and infighting, right?
Right.
because it is exhausting.
Yeah.
Right? Like I have family members in Egypt who were incredibly active during the Arab Spring, and they just got exhausted. And so the thing you alluded to in that I think I talk about in the book, I was talking to a friend of mine about sort of why the Arab Spring had essentially been co-opted and why we were going so close to what was there before, essentially, which is sort of very dictator-like military rule. And instead of sort of talking geopolitics or giving me one, that angle or this, he talked about this thing. I don't know how many of you know this, but like if you're in downtown Egypt and you're parking your car on the side of the road, like you're parallel parking, some dude will pop up out of nowhere. Like inevitably, some guy will pop out and just be like, yeah, yalla, Basha, let's go, like this. This guy's called a Menedi, right? And it shows up and it does this. And the idea is like, what's expected of you is that after you get out, you just like give him a few bucks, right? Like it's fully understood when you live in here, this is how it goes, right? And all he said was like, those guys don't call me sir anymore.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh shit, this is it. Like you knew a hierarchy and you were very, very comfortable with that hierarchy, and now someone's messing with it. And that's enough for you.
Mhm.
Bring back the military. I don't care. Do whatever. I don't give a shit. Just this guy's better be calling me sir. Like people need to know their place. And that's a very difficult thing to contend with when you are trying to think of something like a better world.
Right.
That the guy who's like waving your car back in might be uppity about it is enough to like
Yeah.
bring the whole thing down. It was a terrifying moment. I don't think he realized how terrified I was by it. But that was the first store he went to was a really scary thing.
Yeah. And we see that everywhere. I mean, even here I remember in Seattle, in the fight for to get $15 an hour minimum wage, and you'd hear comments going, well, if a fast food worker is going to get $15, do I get a raise? Right? Because it wasn't, I might be fine, but I need to know I'm making the same amount more at the end of the day. Something went really wrong if I end up making the same as a fast food worker. Even if I still have the same buying power I had before, even if I'm still, I still go home to the same privilege I had before, like I have to know at the end of the day that everything I sacrificed to be in this spot was worth it. And it's not worth it if I can't feel better than the people below me. And I think what is interesting when I was reading this book is I think about how that works internationally as well, right? So like my degree was in international relations, and I remember thinking as a Black American, how little the average American understands about what the US does around the world. And how directly that is actually tied to systemic oppression in the US itself. But you have this place and how much, when we look at here, like, as a Black woman, I'm constantly faced with people who think they're doing me a favor by standing with me at a protest, right? Who think they're doing me a favor by retweeting me and crying when they hear about awful things that I or people like me endure, and that, they're in it for me, right? Because they have no place. Actually, they have nothing to gain. This is a charity thing they're participating in. And how that also means that when something disrupts the hierarchy, they stop, right? They envision this was their Eat, Pray, Love journey. They were going to be the hero of this story.
Right.
I was going to thank them. Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. If you weren't standing next to me, I wouldn't have known. But the thing that was wild to me, and especially like around this last election, is seeing how exactly so many members of my own community were talking the same way about Palestine. Oh, it's so awful. It's so sad. I will go to a march, but there are things we have to understand about how the world works. But this can't impact me. This can't risk my job. This can't risk my sense of well-being. And I was like, you understand this is the same fundamentally supremacist feeling, right? What could possibly disadvantage me, make me uncomfortable, is more important than what is absolutely verifiably happening right now to you. And that separation that we refuse to look at, that you can be, and I love the way that your book seems to really struggle with that. You can be an oppressed member of a population and still part of a global colonizer, a global war machine that does a huge amount of harm. And the exact same mindset that leads to you being oppressed is what leads to you to be able to look away to what's happening to everyone else. And we're making the exact same compromises. And it is, in fact, often a more devastating scale. We're divorced from it. You know, you don't actually have to, just the same way in which you can live in a white neighborhood and be divorced from what happens in Black neighborhoods, what happens in Native communities. You know, you can look at it and go, it's so sad what happens in the South. It's so sad what happens in Missouri. It's so sad what happens on reservations. And it's not yours. We can say, oh, it's, you know, the amount of actual, like other Black people I heard saying, genocide has always happened in the Middle East. War has always happened in the Middle East. US government has always funded genocide. Like people literally just throwing that out like a casual, like the sun always rises. And I love the way that you talk about this and wrestle with this. If there was something that you want people to understand, like about the impact of the world and how this looks outside of the US, because you've had, I guess, the privilege to be, especially as a journalist and have grown up outside of the US, to kind of see this on both sides, to be a part of it, but also like be directly impacted by it.
No one's asked me that yet. That's really fascinating. There's this book that came out many years ago called A Bright Shining Lie, and it's a book about Vietnam and how everything the US did went to shit there, and it's told through the prism of this one guy who was, for a time, the sort of top civilian administrator for the US in Vietnam. So it's an amazing piece of journalism. And Neil Shin, the guy who wrote it, it almost ruined his life to write this book. Like, it was, but it's, you know, every now and then somebody will ask me about like the best book I've read on the US invasion of Afghanistan or Iraq. And I always point them to that book, which was written like decades before any of this, because I think it says something about the American relationship with empire and with the rest of the world that I think remains true to this day. And there's a passing section in that book where he talks about the distinction between sort of the British conception of empire and the American conception of empire. And in one case, you have the colonizer saying, you know, yes, these are the savages, but it is my duty to civilize them. And then this sort of comes as one of the highlights of like the British approach to colonialism, whereas in the US mode, that doesn't exist. We're not an empire. We're sort of benevolent and sort of, and I have no obligation. You lift yourself up and that sort of thing. And both are sort of horrendous in their own ways, but it's an interesting distinction. Where I grew up in Qatar, there's a military base outside Doha. It's a fairly significant one. It was founded during the first Gulf War when I was at the American International School at the time, and we visited. And they had us write thank you cards to the soldiers. Yeah, it was a weird one. But that base since then has become incredibly sprawling, and I think Qatar essentially pays for it. And if one day the royal family said we're not going to do this anymore, I'm pretty well guaranteed that the following day Saudi Arabia would invade, because they'd get a phone call saying like green light. This kind of stuff is so much harder to kind of like lay bare on the table than the overt maneuvers of empire that we're used to historically, right? They invaded. Biggest American embassy in the world is currently being built in Lebanon. Why the hell do you need a 5,000 person embassy in Lebanon? What is that? Like there's a notion of how this country maneuvers elsewhere in the world being much more opaque than what we historically sort of associate with like, here comes the cavalry kind of thing. And so it's a difficult thing to conceptualize, particularly when like for the thick middle of this country that gets its news from the nightly news or like, you know, gets those sort of media and conduits of information, none of that stuff exists. Just like essentially Palestinians don't exist. It's an offensive word to even use in the context of the nightly news, right? And so you're up against something like that. I guess, you know, again, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm not trying to argue with anyone, but I wish that in this part of the world, it was more understood that the privilege of not seeing these things is not afforded to somebody on the receiving end of them.
Mhm.
It's just not. I mean, look, I don't think this is a book that's going to be remembered. I think if it is remembered, it's going to be remembered as one of the tamest of its kind.
Mhm.
You know, Muhammad al-Kurd's book is going to be remembered. Musaba Toha's poetry is going to be remembered. Isabel Haman's essays are going to be remembered. Adania Shibley's novel is going to go down as one of the best of the century. This is incredibly tame compared to the sort of anger that I'm seeing everywhere I go.
Mhm.
Because you're not bound by a particular kind of narrative. You can look at the thing as it is, and you can become proportionally upset. And I wish that was more readily visible in this part of the world. But it's not, and I guess that is one of the central sort of advantages of living here. So none of that stuff has to matter at all.
Right. This is the last question, and so y'all think of your questions that you want to ask for Q&A. That reminds me, actually, you know, as Rick said, I just got back from Jaipur, and we were doing a panel on the new America, and a lot of people curious as to what's next for America. And the
You got any tips for us? What is the new America?
I know, right? And people just kept asking. It was a really engaged audience, like more engaged than I've ever seen at a book festival ever. If you ever get invited, please go to this festival. Hundreds of people asking, and they kept asking versions of what are Americans doing? What are they doing? Why? They're like, why are they making such bad choices? And the thing that was interesting was the moderator was a journalist who was Indian but lived in the States. And he said, all right, so audience, this is going to shock you. And he was like, the US has basically like 5 major news agencies, and they run about 90% of the news. And only about 10% of Americans watch it. And the audience was like, what? What? And he was like, whereas we have about 100 news agencies and about 80% of the population watches on a regular basis. And so my partner and I went back to our hotel and we started scrolling through the TV, and sure enough, it's hundreds of pages of news from all over the world. And to me, it recognizes like what an effective tool of empire, like keeping the population that likes to think of itself as benevolent or even just fully independent, right? Needs to not know. And that brings me to, I saw your conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates, which was beautiful and amazing. If you missed it, I'm so sorry. And you were coming back to, why are so many people refusing to talk about this? And so I guess I want to like, final question is like, what do you feel the role of writers and journalists is right now when we look at how heavily invested empire is in keeping people from looking at what's happening in the world?
Look, I think at a basic level, if you are a writer, you are engaged in saying something about what it means to be human, right? That is at the most fundamental level, me and someone who writes something entirely different than the whole spectrum, we have that in common, right? We're trying to say something about what it means to be human. And so I think that you know, I wasn't able to write about anything else for 1.5 years. I wasn't. And writing is my first avenue of retreat.
Mm-hmm.
When the world doesn't make sense to me, and it quite often doesn't make sense to me, that I go to the page immediately, knowing full well that it's not going to make any more sense to me afterwards, but still, that's the place I go to sit with that uncertainty and to sort of try to put something on the page. You write about whatever the hell you want, right? Write about whatever the hell you want. But if you are in another moment going to start quoting Baldwin at me, and going to start going to these writers that are now afforded this after the fact sainthood, but were despised in their time because they didn't wait, then whatever the hell you're engaged in is not what I would consider the work of writing. It might be another kind of work, and it might be incredibly lucrative, and it might work out for you great, fantastic. But, I remember reading this interview with Baldwin. I think it was in the Paris Review many, many years ago, and he was living in France, and the interviewer was like, "Oh, what a fun literary adventure that you're on. You're getting to follow in the footsteps of Hemingway and Fitzgerald." And he's like, "No, I had to leave the US. They were going to kill me." Right? I was too angry to be a Black man in America. I had to leave. And the understanding of the difference between saying this stuff in the moment and agreeing with it after the fact, I think, is a central part of being engaged in the work of any kind of storytelling right now. And I haven't said a single fucking thing in this book that a million other people haven't been saying for a very long time. And if this ends up getting all this extra attention, I think it's a direct function of it having been written by a guy who is complicit in all of this, because it doesn't feel far away, right? Like, you can read this book, you can love it, you can hate it, but if you are from this part of the world, it's not going to feel far away in the way it's written, right? Because I know this place, right? I think the distinction I will make between sort of this kind of work and literature and journalism is that in terms of journalism, I think most journalists are quite excellent at their jobs, and I think in a vacuum produce amazing work. I think every journalist, particularly in a moment like this, but generally at all times, has to ask themselves, what is the story that you would write in that vacuum with no external pressure? And what is the story that you are writing with those external pressures imposed, right? The fear of loss of advertising, of access, of someone yelling at you on Twitter, the comments section, career aspirations, being moved off that beat. What do those two stories look like? How big is the gap between them? And if there is a gap, what the hell are you doing about it? Right? Because that, to me, is the definition of bad journalism. But look, there's no doubt in my mind that there's going to be a million books written in this part of the world about the slaughter, about the genocide. And I strongly suspect it's going to follow the same trajectory as something like the war in Iraq, where for the first little while, the imposition was silence. Shut the hell up, say nothing. But then slowly the door starts to open, and who walks through it first? Former Marines who want to write short story collections about how sad it made them to have to kill all those brown people, right? Like, there's going to be, and you're going to see it too with like, once Western journalists are allowed into Gaza and start telling you the exact same thing that Palestinian journalists have been telling you for a much longer time, there's going to be a level of gravitas and a level of import that's going to kick in. We know this. We've seen this trajectory a million times over. If you're engaged in the work of writing, write about whatever the hell you want. But don't throw those Baldwin quotes at me. And then keep your head down and look up every once in a while and figure out when you can write that really beautiful story about all the bodies in the rubble.
All right. So it's time for questions and answers. So we have a question right here. If you want to.
أنا مولودة في من اسكندرية, so
أهلا
أهلا
بيك.
وسهلا. I guess this is a personal question because I was also born in Egypt, in Alexandria. I was raised in Jersey. Inexplicably, I also found myself in the Northwest. So I'm curious how you, this was the worst culture shock I've ever had in my life, moving to Seattle. So I'm curious about your experience. You're laughing because you know what I'm talking about. What your experience in the Northwest is, and what inspires you to write while you're here away. Like, culturally, New Jersey is like Egypt part 2. So it wasn't hard to, those of you in New Jersey know, but here that's not true. Like, it's few and far between when I run into Arabs, and it's like I just met Layla, and it's like a celebration, when we meet other Arabs. But I'm curious about how long have you been, I haven't read any of your work, so I will after today, but I'm curious about living here and choosing to be so far away. I mean, I am too, so I'm curious about that.
عايز أرد عليكي بالعربي بس سبت مصر وأنا عندي 5 سنين. We're just making fun of all the rest of you at this point. Just a heads up, that's what's happening. My wife got a job at the university down there. So we were living in Canada, and the first year of her postdoc, she applied just in Canada, got no offers. The next year she applied everywhere. She got 4 offers, and they were all in the US. And Portland was by far the most livable of those places. I got nothing against Waco, Texas, but it was it was going to be a tough sell. They offered her the job and then they flew her down to Texas and they were doing the sales pitch, you know, and they were like, so had you ever heard of Waco before? And she was like, yeah. And they were like, oh, because George W. Bush lives here. She's like, no. So we did the campus visit to Portland, and it happened to be the warmest Valentine's Day in like 30 years. And so everybody was warning us. They're like, it's not like this. I promise you, it's not like this. So we had just come over from Toronto. We were like, it's exactly like this. We're definitely coming here. So we got, and that's how we ended up. And I realized recently that it's now been 11 and a half years, which is the longest I've lived in anywhere, really. So yeah, I don't really leave the house. I mean, like, so the lack of community for me was something I only sort of realized a long time later. It is weird, right? Because there's an upfront warmth when you meet someone, and then right behind that is something else entirely. And there's not much I miss about Egypt, like the chaos, the whatever, but man, the people and that warmth, I miss that. I miss that quite a bit. One of my friends recently said, you know, if everything about Egypt was different, it would be the best place on earth. And I was like, yep, that's right. That's about right. Like a leak.
Am I supposed to be pointing? Okay.
Hi, so I was at the Ta-Nehisi Coates thing last week, and something that's been kind of sticking with me since your conversation with him was the idea that we don't share facts. That it's no longer about, I have my opinion, you have your opinion, but we don't even see the same world. So I was curious of your thoughts on how to address that as a society, or what maybe news sources you think should be amplified to help us perhaps get to a more shared place, at least that we agree on what's actually true.
Yeah, thank you for that. So when I worked, the only real job I've ever had was as a journalist. I was a reporter for 10 years, and one of my friends was the content moderator for the website for this newspaper. And at one point she was telling me about this piece of software that they had to buy, which is, because they would get so much like really loathsome stuff on, and if it was just loathsome stuff, that'd be fine. But there's always like one person who happens to be a subject matter expert who has an amazing comment, like, which makes the whole thing even more frustrating, because if it was just all drivel, you could just shut it down or something. But she was telling me about this piece of software they have where if someone's consistently posting like super racist, super offensive stuff, what it would do is it would take their IP address and it would block their comment from everything but their own IP address. So they would think that their comment had been posted, but nobody else would see it. It's really, really sort of underappreciated how deeply lonely a lot of people who do this kind of stuff are. My general theory, and it might be completely wrong, is that I don't think that the level of derangement has changed too much. I think the neighborhood of derangement has afforded itself so many more amenities. Like, it used to be a time where if you believed something that was just patently untrue, you were confined to a particular space. You could go out into the woods and start mailing angry letters to people. And now, you know, if you believe the most horrific, patently untrue thing, you have an entire online ecosystem and neighborhood. You can go on Facebook and find a yoga instructor who believes the same thing, right? Like the amenities of that neighborhood have become enough such that you never need to leave, right? And that's a terrifying thing for me. I think, generally speaking, the way I tend to think about news sources right now is in terms of those external pressure vectors, because, you know, generally speaking, there are New York Times reporters who I trust their factual reporting in certain parts of the world because I see fewer of those vectors. Do I trust the reporting on Palestine? Not for a second, right? But that takes work, right? Like you in a healthy, functional society, you should be able to wake up in the morning and pick up the newspaper and not have to do that work in real time as you're reading the story, right? You shouldn't have to worry about whether the New York Times correspondent reporting this is living in a stolen house, right? And I think it imposes an obligation on the citizen that should be unreasonable. But the only alternative is to then read it as a flat landscape where 80% of the time, fine, that seems about right. And then all of a sudden you're just presented a version of events that is torqued in such a way as to avoid consequences for the person writing it or the news outlet publishing it. The very first day I was in the UK, I did a BBC interview. I forget, it was like BBC 5 or something, and it was for a podcast. And the interviewer was one of the most thoughtful human beings that I've ever talked to, and we had this incredible conversation. We both were changing our minds about things in real time, and you rarely get that, right? Like, a lot of this stuff is deeply contrived. And I finished it, and I was just like, this was an amazing conversation. Like, this is what being in the world of writing is supposed to be about, right? Like, we're not supposed to just throw punches at each other and stick to our, that thing is never going to air. Like, it's never going to fucking air. It'll never see the light of day. That guy was a really good interviewer, and he seemed like a really good journalist. So sometimes you're in that kind of situation, and I think very highly of most journalists. I just think the infrastructure they're in was never intended to handle this. And I apologize, I will say one more thing and I'll stop rambling at you, I promise. On my way home from the Portland, from the Powell's event, I was listening to NPR, and it was about they're cutting Medicare, right? Like, they want to cut, it was fraud, waste, blah, blah. And it was an interview with an expert, a subject matter expert. And the interviewer was saying something like, the lawmaker from Kansas says that 50% of all expenditures are waste. What do you have to say to that? This person, like, you could tell that she was trying to keep some sense of decorum as complete fantasy was being thrown her way, right? Like, and she was like, well, there's no evidence of this at all. The research we do suggests that there is approximately 5% in terms of errors, like mathematical errors in billing. That is the only. And the thing the journalist said next was so fascinating to me, because she said, well, this person says 50%, you say 5%. Is there not like a middle ground between this? And I was like, this is the journalism model. This is a journalism model that I was brought up on. And it assumes a level of good faith, right? Like, it assumes it's actually like, there's something decent and human about, and you are watching it fail in real time, right? And so one of the things that I think relates to your question is just keep in mind, when you see that model applied, that it only works when everyone involved is acting in good faith. Otherwise, we need something else entirely, and we need a model of journalism that allows for someone in a position of reporting to say, that is bullshit. Without that, I think we're screwed.
To keep time for all of you to get your book signed, we're just going to do 2 more questions.
You mentioned, son.
Yeah.
You mentioned that this would be the tamest book that we'll read about this topic, but even in the way you answer the questions, there's an anger inside you that I think we can all relate to. Like, I wake up angry every day. Any conversation that I have that I think starts with some sort of level of decorum devolves into anger when someone just doesn't get it. So how did you get through an entire book and keep it tame, knowing that as you start to speak on this topic, there's only one emotion, right, that comes out. So either every rewrite got less angry, or you have a level of self-control that I could never imagine.
It's not even the anger. Like I've had 43 years of being a brown guy, mostly in the West, right? And so I think either consciously or subconsciously you're aware at all times that once you pass a certain threshold, what you are imagined capable of doing suddenly becomes infinite. We got into this weird situation up in Canada involving a literary prize that was sponsored by a bank that's one of the biggest foreign investors in Elbit Systems, which is this Israeli weapons maker, right? And because we had previously had involvement with this award, a bunch of writers tried to pressure the award to either cut ties with this bank or get the bank to sort of disinvest. And ultimately, and this is work that had been, you know, activists were working on this for years before any of us showed up. So I don't want to at all take credit for this. I did the bare minimum. I signed a couple of letters. I did a couple of interviews. There's been activists working on this for years. And eventually it worked. Like eventually they cut ties and the bank also started cutting its investment, which is how change happens, right? Like a bunch of people risk a lot. And then a bunch of people like me show up at the last second and we take a little bit of the credit. But generally speaking, like, and you move things an inch this way, and it's slow and it's tedious. But during that process, at some point, I think there was a counter narrative established that this was a bunch of writers who were picking on this prize, especially because the family behind it is Jewish, and that this was a sort of anti-Semitic thing that was happening, which you believe whatever the hell you want. I don't, you know, like, but what proceeded to happen over the course of months was that you would get op-eds, sort of like dragging your name through the mud. And you know that these op-eds are coming from a person who has a deep connection to the award, and then you would get somebody like posting something patently untrue about you with your picture, with your face attached to it. And then you get hate mail for a while. And then they realize it's patently untrue and they take it down and they say, whoopsie, and you're all expected. And during this whole time, if I had done any of these things, if I was the one who had posted a patently untrue thing with a picture of somebody's, my career would be over. It'd be done, right? Like, I'm not particularly proud of this, but what tempers my anger is a knowledge of the exchange rate, right? I know who I am, and I know the consequences of what I say or what I do. And I know the second that switch flips, I am the worst thing in the world, right? The imagination as it relates to me can go to some real dark places. And I've learned to live with that, right? Like some of you, I'm sure, want to yell at me. You'll see me you can come up to the signing line and I will be the nicest human being you ever met. I will defer, I will be a bit of a coward about all of it, right? Like I've learned that over the years. And I can deal with it, so the anger doesn't bother me. The grief is what gets me, like fucking hell. I was teaching in Qatar. I don't like traveling. I have a bad back, and but I always say yes to Qatar because it's where I grew up, and I want to go see the house I grew up in. My high school friends. Georgetown has a campus there, and they give me a little office, and I have office hours, and this kid walks in. I keep saying kid because he's half my age. This young man walks in, and we're shooting the shit, and he says, you know, he tells me he's from Gaza, and so immediately I ask him, you know, how's your family? And he says, you know, my dad's side got out, but my mom's side is mostly gone. And you're sitting there trying to process this, right? Like trying to process the magnitude of that, right? I was at a movie the other night, and there was a scene where a dog got run over, and the audience fucking gasped, right? This guy just told me that half his bloodline is gone. And 20 minutes afterwards, I have to go give a craft talk, right? Or I have to sit there and be like, the eroticism of run-on sentences in Garth Greenwell's short stories is what, yeah. And look, I love talking about stuff like that. I love nerding out about that, right? But like, it's been a year and a half of seeing the worst fucking thing and then just getting on with your day and getting through it. The anger doesn't bother me that much. I'm angry all of the fucking time and I know how to control it. But the grief building up, that scares me a lot more.
We have one more question. Yeah, please don't go.
Hey, thanks
Hello.
for doing this. And this question is for both of you. People who, you know, use thought, ideas, words as their profession and to communicate to the rest of the world. If you had to use one descriptor to describe Americans, whether that be good, bad, or indifferent, what would that be and why?
The awkward silence you're hearing is both of us trying to wait each other out to see who's going to go first. Yeah, a million years ago, I wrote this short story. So sorry, last rambling answer, I promise. I got an email from an anthology, a guy who was making an anthology, and it was called A People's Future of the United States. And because I'm very lazy, I only read the first part of the pitch. And the first part of the pitch was like, it's the future and things have gone horribly bad and Trump-like administrations have ruled for decades and blah. And I was like, yeah, I can write you a short story about that, no worries. And it was only like long after it was too late to do anything about it that I read the second paragraph, which was like, so we're looking for alternatives to this. And so they got a super dark story that had nothing to do with what they wanted. But it was a story about someone returning to the site of these internment camps that had been built for initially for Muslims and Arabs, but they couldn't tell them apart. So there were like Sikhs being brought in there, and that sort of. And there's one line in that book where in that story where one of the characters says, you know what this country is? This country is someone looking at a burning building and trying to describe it without using the word fire. That's generally sort of how I think about a lot of being in this country.
I love speaking in anecdotes, so I get to do one too now because you've really normalized it tonight.
It's my only
I love
trick.
it. Oh, I love
no
it.
other.
It's like it's one of my favorite things. So I'm
one trick.
super happy here. I
It
love
makes
it.
you sound so much smarter
It's
than you
so
are. 'Cause
nice.
you're like listen to me
Right.
as I tell you the
It's
story that has
very-
barely anything to do with what you asked.
But like we think in stories all the time,
Yeah.
and it's so nice to not have to like make it sound different. But like, no, let me just tell you the thought process that runs through my head all the time, which is 1,000 stories strung together. Years ago, many of y'all will remember when there was a protest. Actually, I believe it was about Palestine at the shopping center downtown, and there was someone screaming in the face of protesters, and someone went and got a security guard and said, there's a guy antagonizing the protesters. Security guard came up and pepper sprayed the first Black man he saw walking through, just trying to get home from work. Guy had nothing to do with the protest. He was just standing there, got pepper sprayed in the face. It was all caught on film. It was, and the look on his face, I always remember he was just like, well, yeah, okay, so this is Wednesday, or whatever day it was. And there was a kind of community meeting, community discussion afterwards to discuss this. So I was on a panel talking about this, and it was a really odd panel because it was me, Charles Mudede, Pramila before she was in office, and someone else, I can't remember. And they kept playing this video on the big screen behind us. So it was very, very like triggering. Like it's a white audience because it's Seattle. And then it's like 4 Black and brown people watching this video of a Black man being pepper sprayed on the large screen. So we're talking about it. People are really angry. We're trying to provide context. And Charles, if y'all know Charles of Stranger fame, does what Charles does, right? Which starts talking about the economic reasoning behind this, right? And talking about, how he was like, hey, y'all are mad at the security guard, you want the security guard fired, but every day the security guard has been told, your job is to protect profits for these companies. And these are who are threats to profit in these companies. And shoppers don't want to see Black men walking through here. And, they're considered a threat. And he's been told every day that Black men are a threat. And so someone comes and says, there's a threatening person. He walks in, looks for who he's been told is a threat, pepper sprays him in the face. And so if you're looking at the cause, that man didn't wake up in the morning and say, I want to pepper spray a Black man in the face today, right? But every day he was told these are the threats, and there's an economic imperative to considering. Anyway, so he's talking about this beautiful, important discussion. As he's talking about it, a white woman stands up and interrupts him. And she says, I didn't come here for an economic lecture. I came here because I'm mad about what happened and I want to feel better.
Wow.
And
it's honest.
It was the most American thing. And I remember I stood up and I just was like, I'm going to go get wine. And I literally left and I walked back to the lobby of the theater and I got 2 bottles of wine. And then I walked back and handed Charles one. And then I proceeded to tell this woman why she was out of pocket. But when I think about the US, I think about this cherished ignorance, this really babied ignorance that surrounds the comfort that we need in order to continue to benefit from so much brutality. And that woman may seem extreme, but she was just saying what so many people who were there rolling their eyes oh, here's Charles doing what Charles does, as if he doesn't know what he's talking about, as if there isn't a reason, as if he just likes to hear himself talk. And they didn't want that. They didn't want to investigate how their spending habits contribute to this. They wanted one working class man to get fired. And that would have fixed it for them. And so like when I think about like America, I think about that. I think about that really coddled, protected, cherished ignorance.
I think of nothing better to end on.
Thank you. This was amazing. This book, y'all, if you don't have it, please, please, please buy it. It is so, it's heartbreaking. It's galvanizing. It's beautiful, like beautifully written. If you love words and you love them used well, this book is truly beautiful. And I'm not just saying that. If you've seen me do book talks, I don't say that very often. I don't say that all the time. This book is absolutely gorgeous. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.